Jake's story. Jake Thompson had driven these roads for years. As a long-haul trucker, the nights were long, the highways endless, and the towns indistinguishable from one another. It was a lonely job, but Jake preferred the solitude. At least that was what he always told himself. The rain that night was relentless, pounding against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. His headlights barely cut through the thick sheets of water, and the wipers worked overtime. It was past midnight, and Jake had another 100 miles before the next truck stop. His eyelids grew heavier by the mile, and he fought the urge to pull over for a nap. The sooner he got to the stop, the sooner he could sleep. As the road wound through a stretch of forest, Jake noticed a figure on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by his high beams. A hitchhiker, standing there, drenched to the bone with his thumb out, waving for a ride. Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing at the empty passenger seat. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he made a habit of. Too many stories about robberies, even murders. But something about this man, his silhouette hunched under the downpour, made Jake reconsider. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the fact that the next town was miles away. He flicked on his turn signal and pulled to the side of the road. The hitchhiker approached, moving slowly as if each step was a battle against the elements. Jake rolled down the window, the cold rain splashing into the cab. "Need a lift?" Jake called out. The man nodded without a word. He wore an old coat, the kind you'd expect to see on someone from another time. His face was obscured by the hood, but Jake could see the lines of his jaw, pale and sunken. There was something off about him, but Jake couldn't place it. "Hop in," Jake said, unlocking the door. The hitchhiker climbed in silently, pulling the door shut behind him. The truck's interior was suddenly filled with a strange, metallic smell, like wet iron. Jake glanced at the man, but he simply stared ahead, his face hidden beneath the hood. "Where you headed?" Jake asked, trying to break the silence. "East," the man replied, his voice low and rough, like gravel being crushed underfoot. Jake frowned. "East? That's pretty vague. Got a town in mind?" The hitchhiker turned his head slightly, just enough for Jake to catch a glimpse of his eyes, cold and empty. "Just drive." A shiver crawled up Jake's spine, but he ignored it, focusing on the road ahead. The rain hadn't let up, and the night was as dark as ever. For miles, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the truck's engine and the persistent tapping of rain on the windshield. After a while, Jake noticed something strange. The hitchhiker hadn't moved since he got in. His hands rested in his lap, motionless, and he hadn't even tried to shake off the water that had soaked through his coat. "You been out there long?" Jake asked, casting a sideways glance. The man didn't respond at first, but then, after a long pause, he said, "Long enough." "Where you coming from?" The hitchhiker's lips curled into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Far away." Jake felt a growing unease. He had picked up hitchhikers before, but none of them had been this unsettling. There was something wrong about this man, something that gnawed at the edges of Jake's mind. "I've been down these roads before," the hitchhiker said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Passed through these woods many times. People don't always make it out." Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean by that?" The hitchhiker turned his head fully now, and Jake could see his face more clearly. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, like bottomless pits. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? The ones about people disappearing on nights just like this. Stormy nights, when the road stretches on forever, and you can't tell if you're going in circles." Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his focus on the road. He'd heard stories, sure. Truckers always swapped tales of haunted highways and cursed stretches of road, but those were just stories, weren't they? The hitchhiker leaned in slightly. "Sometimes people pick up the wrong passenger." The air inside the cab felt thicker, oppressive. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He regretted stopping now. Every instinct screamed at him to get this man out of his truck, to leave him on the side of the road and speed off into the night. But something kept him frozen, as if the hitchhiker's presence had rooted him to his seat. The rain had lessened to a drizzle now, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. There hadn't been a turnoff in miles, no signs, no landmarks. It was as if they were driving through a void. The hitchhiker's voice broke the silence again. "You can feel it, can't you? That something's wrong, that the road isn't what it seems." Jake's throat felt dry. He tried to swallow, but couldn't. "What are you talking about?" The man grinned, a slow, twisted grin that made Jake's blood run cold. "You've picked up more than you bargained for." Suddenly, the lights on the dashboard flickered. The engine sputtered, and the truck began to slow down. Jake's eyes widened as he pressed the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The truck coasted to a stop in the middle of the road. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. The headlights flickered once more, and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, the sound of wet fabric creaking in the silence. "Looks like your truck's done for." Jake fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. He cursed under his breath and turned to the hitchhiker. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but..." His voice trailed off when he saw that the passenger seat was empty. The hitchhiker was gone. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anything. Panic surged through him as he grabbed the door handle and swung it open, stepping out into the cold night air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Where the hell did you go?" The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with fog, swirling around him like a living thing. Jake took a few hesitant steps away from the truck, squinting into the darkness. The road stretched on for miles, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. No sound, no movement, nothing. Just as he was about to turn back to the truck, he heard it. A faint whisper, his name. "Jake," he froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jake." He spun around, his eyes darting through the fog. There was no one there. The road was empty, the woods silent. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, standing just at the edge of the fog. The hitchhiker. But something was different now. His shape was distorted, twisted, like a shadow that didn't belong. Jake backed up toward the truck, his heart racing. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice shaking. "Stay the hell away from me." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him with those empty, dark eyes. And then, slowly, it began to walk forward. Jake scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands fumbled with the keys as he tried to start the engine again, but it was dead. He glanced out the window, and the figure was closer now, its twisted form looming out of the fog. Desperation clawed at him as he reached for his phone, praying for a signal. His hands trembled as he dialed, but the screen remained blank. No signal, no help. The figure was at the window now, its face inches from the glass, its eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The whisper came again, soft and cold. "Jake?" Suddenly, the truck's lights flickered back on. The engine roared to life, and without thinking, Jake slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching on the wet pavement. The figure disappeared into the fog as Jake sped down the road, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get away. His life depended on it. He didn't stop. Not for miles, not until the sun began to rise on the horizon. The fog lifted, and the road stretched out before him, clear and endless. But Jake knew he would never be the same. The experience he had had jolted his nerves badly. A nightmare he would always carry with him. He had picked up more than just a hitchhiker that night. Something far worse had taken a seat beside him, and it would haunt him for the rest of his days. Strangers on the road. It was the middle of summer when Jenny Richards decided to take a road trip to visit her parents in a rural town far from the city lights. The open road offered freedom. The windows of her car were down, and the warm breeze brushed through her hair as she sped down the highway. She had always loved driving at night. There was something peaceful about the way the road stretched endlessly before her. The headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the unknown. But on this particular night, That feeling of peace was elusive. Something about the air felt different. The moon was unusually low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the deserted road. The trees that lined the highway seemed to lean in closer, their branches gnarled and twisted like the arms of old, forgotten giants. Her phone had no signal, not that it mattered. Jenny had driven this route many times and knew the way by heart. She was halfway to her destination, with miles of dark road ahead and not a soul in sight. That was when she saw him. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road, his thumb outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. At first, Jenny considered driving past him. She had heard enough stories to know that picking up strangers could lead to trouble. But something about him made her slow down. He looked harmless, just a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He stood there, drenched in sweat under the oppressive summer heat, his face pale and weary. Jenny hesitated but finally pulled over a few feet ahead of him. She glanced in the rearview mirror as the man approached, his steps slow and deliberate. She had a sinking feeling in her gut but pushed it aside. After all, it was just one guy. He didn't look dangerous. He leaned down to the window, a nervous smile spreading across his face. "Hey, thanks for stopping. I've been walking for miles." "No problem," Jenny replied, forcing a smile. "Where you headed?" "Anywhere far from here," he said, a strange edge to his voice. Jenny frowned. "Okay, well, I'm heading about an hour out. I can take you that far if you want." "That's perfect," he said, and without another word, he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. As they started down the road again, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man didn't say much, just stared out the window as the trees whipped past. Occasionally, he'd glance over at her, but when their eyes met, he'd quickly look away. "So where are you coming from?" Jenny asked, trying to make small talk. The man hesitated before answering. "Just around. Been traveling for a while, trying to get away from things." Jenny nodded, though his vague answer didn't sit right with her. "You got a name?" He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and hollow. "It's Will." "Will," Jenny repeated, her fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "I'm Jenny." Will didn't respond, just turned back to the window, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed, and the silence between them grew heavier. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the woods. Jenny kept glancing at the gas gauge, realizing she would need to stop soon. There was a gas station about 20 miles ahead, a small place she remembered from previous trips. She decided to pull in there, get some gas, and maybe some distance from her uneasy passenger. As they approached the gas station, the bright fluorescent lights stood out starkly against the dark woods. Jenny pulled up to the pump, and the station seemed deserted. No cars, no people, just an empty lot and a dimly lit convenience store. "I'm gonna grab some gas," Jenny said as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "You want anything from the store?" Will shook his head, his face still expressionless. "No, I'm good." Jenny nodded, stepping out of the car and walking toward the store. As she neared the entrance, she glanced back at the car. Will was still sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, even though his eyes weren't on her. The bell above the door chimed as she entered the convenience store. A middle-aged man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper as she approached. "Hey," Jenny said, trying to sound casual. "Just filling up the tank." The man finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he glanced outside at her car. "You alone?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Jenny hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I've got a passenger." The man's gaze lingered on the car for a moment longer before he spoke again. "Be careful out there. Not many people come through these parts after dark." "Yeah," Jenny said, unnerved by his tone. "I'll keep that in mind." She paid for the gas and headed back to the car. As she approached, she noticed Will wasn't in the passenger seat anymore. Panic flickered through her, but then she saw him standing by the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the gas station lights. He was staring into the darkness, unmoving, rattling the still night. "Hey, Will," Jenny called, her voice wavering. "You okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. A A cold shiver crept up Jenny's spine as she walked toward him, the crunch of gravel under her feet echoing in the still night. "Will?" He finally turned to face her, and Jenny's heart nearly stopped. His face was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were wide and wild, his chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. "Get back in the car," Will said, his voice low and urgent. "What? What's going on?" Jenny asked, her pulse quickening. "Just get in the car," he snapped, his voice suddenly filled with fear. Without another word, Jenny ran back to the car, her heart pounding in her chest. Will followed close behind, his footsteps quick and frantic. As soon as they were both inside, Jenny slammed the door shut and locked it. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled for the keys, but she managed to start the engine. The car roared to life, and she peeled out of the gas station, her tires screeching on the pavement. "What the hell was that about?" Jenny demanded, her voice trembling. Will didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, his eyes wide with terror. "Will," she shouted, glancing at him. "What did you see?" "Someone's following us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jenny's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? There's no one here." Will turned to face her, his eyes filled with a terror that sent chills down her spine. "I saw him. He was in the woods, watching us." Jenny's heart raced as she looked in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind them, just the dark, empty road stretching out into the night. "You're freaking me out, Will," Jenny said, her voice shaking. "There's no one out there." Will didn't respond. He just sat there, his body tense, his eyes glued to the side mirror. Minutes passed in tense silence. The road was dark and deserted, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. Jenny kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following them. But there was nothing, just the empty highway and the oppressive darkness. Suddenly, Will grabbed her arm, his grip tight and desperate. "There! Did you see that?" Jenny's heart skipped a beat as she glanced in the mirror. But there was nothing, just the road as empty as ever. "Will, you're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling. "There's nothing there." But Will didn't let go. His eyes were wide with fear, his grip tightening on her arm. "He's coming for us," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "He won't stop until he gets what he wants." "What are you talking about?" Jenny demanded, pulling her arm free. "Who's coming for us?" Will didn't answer. He just stared out the window, his face pale and haunted. Jenny could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that made her stomach twist in knots. "I can't do this," she muttered, pulling the car to the side of the road. She turned to Will, her voice shaking. "Get out. I'm sorry, but I can't do this. You're scaring the hell out of me." Will didn't move. He just sat there staring out the window, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Will, get out of the car!" Jenny shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Finally, Will turned to face her, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it sent chills down her spine. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but it's too late. But it's time." Before Jenny could react, the car windows shattered with an ear-splitting crash. Someone, had slammed into the side of the car with a force that sent the vehicle skidding off the road and into the trees. Jenny screamed, her heart racing as she tried to regain control of the car. But it was too late. The car careened off the road and crashed into the trees, the impact sending her head slamming into the steering wheel. Everything went black. When Jenny finally came to, the car was still, the engine dead. Her head throbbed with pain, and her vision was blurry. She reached up to touch her forehead and winced as her fingers came away sticky with blood. She turned to look at Will, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door hanging open. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for her seatbelt, her hands shaking. She pushed the door open and stumbled out of the car, her legs weak and unsteady. "Will!" she called, her voice trembling. "Will, where are you?" But there was no answer. The woods were silent, the trees towering over her like dark, twisted shadows. Jenny's heart raced as she stumbled forward, her vision still blurry. She had to find Will. She couldn't leave him out here, not like this. As she moved deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting and gnarling like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. Jenny's heart skipped a beat as she squinted, trying to make out who it was. "Will?" she called, her voice trembling. But as the figure moved closer, Jenny's blood ran cold. It wasn't Will. It was him. The man from the woods, the one Will had seen. His eyes were dark and hollow, his face twisted into a cruel, predatory smile. Jenny turned to run, but it was too late. He was already upon her. The last thing she heard was the sound of his cold, merciless laughter echoing through the woods as the darkness swallowed her whole. The vanishing passenger. Todd Harris was running late, again. His night shift at the diner had ended later than usual, and he was already exhausted. With a long stretch of highway ahead of him, he just wanted to get home, collapse on the bed, and forget that the past 12 hours ever happened. The night was unusually quiet as his car sped down the rural road. The clock on the dashboard read 1:22 a.m., and except for the occasional flicker of distant headlights, the highway was deserted. The sky was overcast, with thick clouds shrouding the moon. The trees along the road seemed to lean inward, their dark outlines creating an oppressive tunnel around him. Todd glanced at the gas gauge, noting that he had enough fuel to make it home, but not by much. He sighed, turning up the radio in hopes that music might keep his eyes from drooping. Just as the radio host's voice came on, announcing some late-night talk show, Todd spotted something up ahead. In the distance, through the mist that was beginning to form along the road, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the highway. His headlights illuminated a man, his thumb extended in the classic hitchhiker gesture. Todd's first instinct was to drive past. It was too late for him to be picking up strangers. And besides, who hitchhiked in the middle of the night on a deserted road? But as his car neared the man, something about the hitchhiker gave him pause. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with a thin jacket and jeans, shivering in the cool night air. His face was drawn, pale, and desperate. Todd felt a pang of guilt. He had been in situations where he needed help before, and he couldn't just leave the guy stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. He slowed down, pulling up beside the man, and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" Todd asked, leaning out slightly. The man nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Yeah, please," he said in a hoarse voice. "I've been out here for hours. No one's stopping." Todd unlocked the door, and the hitchhiker climbed in, clutching his small backpack tightly. He closed the door with a soft click, and for a moment, the only sound in the car was the gentle hum of the engine. "Thanks for picking me up," the man said after a pause, his voice quiet but sincere. "No problem," Todd replied, turning back onto the road. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere closer to town would be good," the hitchhiker replied, his voice almost a whisper. Todd nodded, stealing a glance at his new passenger. There was something odd about the man, something that Todd couldn't quite put his finger on. His clothes were soaked, as though he had been standing out in the rain, though it hadn't rained in days. The air inside the car had taken on a damp chill, despite the windows being shut tight. "Been out here long?" Todd asked, trying to make conversation, if only to shake off the strange unease creeping over him. The hitchhiker was silent for a moment, staring out the window into the darkness. "A few hours, I think," he finally said, his voice distant. "It's hard to tell time out here." Todd frowned but didn't press further. He flicked his gaze back to the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The longer they drove, the heavier the air in the car seemed to get. The oppressive silence grew louder, punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt. Todd tried to distract himself. "So, been traveling long?" The hitchhiker turned to him slowly, his eyes dark and shadowed. "Yeah, too long. Been trying to get back home, but it's been hard." "Where's home?" "Don't know anymore," the hitchhiker replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Todd felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he forced a smile. "Well, we'll get you closer at least. Shouldn't be too long before we hit town." The hitchhiker didn't respond, just turned back to the window, staring out into the dense darkness beyond. Todd glanced at the man's reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the way his face seemed to blur in the dim light. The unease in Todd's gut twisted tighter. He'd picked up plenty of hitchhikers before. Rural roads like this one saw their fair share of stranded travelers, but none of them had ever made him feel like this. Minutes ticked by, and the road stretched endlessly ahead, a winding ribbon of black that seemed to go on forever. The mist thickened, curling like fingers around the trees and obscuring the edges of the road. Todd squinted, the visibility getting worse by the minute. As they rounded a bend, the headlights caught something in the distance. Another figure, standing at the edge of the road, thumb extended in an eerie mimicry of the hitchhiker Todd had already picked up. Todd's breath hitched. What were the chances? 2 hitchhikers alone on this desolate road at this hour? The man in the passenger seat suddenly spoke, his voice sharp and filled with fear. "Don't stop." Todd turned to him, startled by the sudden intensity in his voice. "What?" "Just keep driving," the hitchhiker insisted, his voice low and urgent. "Don't stop for him." Todd frowned but kept his foot on the gas. As they sped past, Todd stole a glance at the second hitchhiker. The man stood motionless, his face hidden in the shadow of a hood. He didn't move, didn't flinch as the car passed, his thumb still raised in that unnerving, frozen pose. "Do you know him?" Todd asked, his voice shaky. The hitchhiker didn't answer. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the edges of his seat so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The chill in the car grew more intense, seeping into Todd's bones, making him shiver despite the summer heat outside. "What the hell's going on?" Todd demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I told you, don't stop," the hitchhiker muttered, his voice trembling. "They're not what they seem." Todd swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What do you mean, they?" The hitchhiker turned to him, his face ashen. "There are more of them. They're all over this road, waiting. You stop, and you'll never leave." Todd's pulse raced as he gripped the wheel tighter, his mind racing. What are they?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes wide with terror. Todd's mind reeled. He wanted to dismiss the hitchhiker's words as nonsense, but the fear in the man's voice, the absolute conviction, made it impossible. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but the road behind them was empty. Or was it? In the distance, through the thickening mist, Todd could just make out something, movement. A figure, barely visible through the fog, standing in the middle of the road. "Look out!" the hitchhiker shouted. Todd slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. The figure was directly in front of them now, standing in the center of the road, its face hidden in the shadows of its hood. Todd's heart raced as he struggled to catch his breath. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its hooded head tilted slightly as if watching them. "Go," the hitchhiker whispered, his voice shaking. "Don't wait. Go." But Todd couldn't move. His hands were frozen on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the figure. Something about it, something wasn't right. And then, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. Then another. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as though it was being controlled by some unseen force. Todd's breath caught in his throat as the figure approached the car, its hood falling back to reveal a face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. Its eyes were wide and empty, black as the void, staring straight through him. The hitchhiker beside him let out a strangled cry. "Drive! Now! Go!" With a jolt, Todd snapped out of his paralysis, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, and the figure vanished from sight as they sped down the road, the mist swirling around them like a living thing. Todd's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell was that? The hitchhiker didn't answer. He was shaking, his face pale as a ghost. For the next few miles, neither of them spoke. The air in the car was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the thump of Todd's racing heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw the distant glow of the town lights ahead. Relief flooded Todd's chest as the road began to open up, the dense woods thinning as they approached civilization. Todd glanced at the hitchhiker, ready to drop him off at the next gas station or diner. "We're almost there," he said, his voice shaky but calm. "You okay?" But when he looked over, the passenger seat was empty. The hitchhiker was gone, vanished in the thin air. Todd's heart skipped a beat as he slammed on the brakes, his eyes darting around the car. The passenger door was still locked, and there was no sign of the man who had been sitting beside him moments before. For a moment, Todd sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Where had the hitchhiker gone? And more importantly, what had he been running from? Shaking, Todd put the car back in drive and continued into town, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. All he knew was that he would never, ever stop for a hitchhiker again. The man in the rear view. It was nearing midnight when Jenna, eyes heavy with fatigue, decided she could drive no further. She had been on the road for hours, escaping a suffocating life in the city, yearning for the calm and freedom that the countryside promised. But after mile upon mile of nothing but deserted roads and thick forest, her nerves were beginning to fray. The radio had long since lost its signal, leaving only static and her own thoughts to keep her company. She was somewhere deep in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, where towns were sparse and road signs even more so. The winding roads cut through dense, impenetrable woods, and every so often, an owl would hoot in the distance, making her jump. Jenna wasn't one to scare easily, but the isolated road seemed to have its own pulse, a quiet threat lurking just out of sight. And every so often, as the minutes ticked by, she spotted something in her peripheral vision, a figure standing by the side of the road. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat, standing eerily still. His thumb was extended in the universal hitchhiker gesture. Jenna's immediate instinct was to drive past him, to keep going and ignore the unsettling figure. But something about the way he stood, the desperation in his stance, made her pause. She slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The man wasn't moving, and there were no other cars on the road. Against her better judgment, she pulled over. She reasoned with herself. It was late, it was cold, and maybe he just needed a ride to the next town. Rolling down the window slightly, she called out, "You need a ride?" The man nodded once, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. His eyes, though barely visible in the dim light of her car, seemed to pierce right through her. Jenna shivered, but unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in." The man moved quickly, sliding into the seat beside her. His presence immediately filled the car with an icy chill, the temperature dropping several degrees the moment the door closed. Jenna frowned, wondering if it was her nerves getting to her. His presence immediately filled the car. "Where are you headed?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just down the road," he replied, his voice low and raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Not far." Jenna nodded and hit the gas, her car lurching forward as they continued down the dark, winding road. The man sat in silence, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap, eyes forward, never looking at her. Jenna nodded. She tried to steal a glance at him, but every time she did, he seemed to sense it, turning his head slightly as if warning her to keep her eyes on the road. An uneasy tension settled between them, and Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After several miles of silence, she finally worked up the courage to speak again. "So, where exactly are you going?" The man didn't respond at first. For a moment, Jenna thought he hadn't heard her, but then in that same low, rasping voice, he said, "I'm just passing through." "Passing through where?" she pressed. "Doesn't matter," he murmured, his voice growing quieter. "I'll be gone soon." Jenna swallowed hard, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Something about his answer sent a ripple of fear through her, but she tried to keep calm. She focused on the road ahead, but her mind was racing. What did he mean? "I'll be gone soon?" The road grew narrower, the trees closing in on either side, like a suffocating tunnel. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching across the asphalt like dark fingers reaching for her car. The headlights illuminated only the dense forest and the endless stretch of road ahead, but every now and then she thought she saw movement in the trees, fleeting shadows, disappearing the moment she tried to focus on them. Then, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Her blood ran cold. Sitting in the back seat, barely visible in the dim light, was another man. His face was gaunt, pale, with deep-set, empty eyes staring right at her. He was smiling, a grotesque, twisted grin that sent a shiver down her spine. Jenna gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. She swerved the car slightly, almost veering off the road before regaining control. Frantically, she glanced back at the rear seat, but it was empty. The man was gone. Had she imagined it? Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she glanced at the hitchhiker beside her. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to her near accident. He was still staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Jenna's hands trembled on the wheel. Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" the man replied, his tone flat and emotionless. There was someone in the back seat. The hitchhiker's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "No one there but us," he said softly. Jenna's heart raced. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. She wanted to pull over, to stop and demand answers, but the fear gripping her made her keep driving. She didn't want to be alone on this road, not with this man beside her and whoever, was haunting her back seat. Minutes dragged by in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Jenna's knuckles were white as she clutched the wheel, her mind replaying the image of the man in the back seat over and over again. Was she losing her mind? Suddenly, the man beside her spoke again, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "It's not far now." "Not far to what?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "The end of the road," he replied cryptically, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. Jenna felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" The man's smile widened, and for the first time he turned his head to look at her. His eyes were dark, empty voids, and his face seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the skin was too tight for the bones beneath. "You'll see." Panic surged through Jenna's veins. She slammed her foot on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. The man didn't react. He simply sat there, smiling that eerie, otherworldly smile. Get out, her voice shaking with fear. "Get out of my car." "Han?" The hitchhiker didn't move. He just stared at her, that horrible grin still plastered on his face. "It's too late for that now," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "You should have never stopped." Jenna's blood ran cold. She reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but before she could pull it open, the car's lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in complete silence. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. No signal, no light, just the suffocating darkness and the sound of her own ragged breathing. And then, from the back seat, she heard it, a low, raspy voice. "I'm still here. I'm still here." Terror seized her. She turned, but the back seat was still empty. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere. The hitchhiker leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. His breath was cold, like the air in a morgue. "You should have kept driving." Jenna screamed and threw open the door, tumbling out of the car and into the darkness. She ran, her feet pounding against the asphalt, the cold night air biting at her skin. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. But the road seemed endless, the trees looming over her like towering specters. No matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the sound of that voice echoing in her mind. "I'm still here. I'm still here." Silent passenger. The wind howled through the empty valley as David's car sped down the desolate highway. His headlights were the only source of light for miles, casting long shadows on the road ahead. The The towering pine trees lining the highway seemed to sway ominously, their silhouettes dark and foreboding against the pitch-black sky. It was a moonless night, and the stars barely pierced through the thick clouds that hovered above, threatening rain. David had been on the road for hours, his back aching from the uncomfortable position in the driver's seat. He'd been driving cross-country for a business trip, traveling from one small town to another, selling whatever products the company had assigned to him that month. Tonight, though, the isolation was starting to get to him. The long, empty stretch of road with no signs of civilization had a way of making the mind wander into dark places. As the road stretched endlessly before him, David glanced at his dashboard. He was running low on gas. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He hadn't seen a gas station in over an hour, and the last one he passed was closed. His GPS had long since lost signal, and he had no idea how far he was from the next town. The knot in his stomach tightened as the needle crept closer to E. The night felt heavy with an oppressive silence. Even the radio had lost all signal, leaving only static, which he quickly switched off. David gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, the solitude beginning to gnaw at him. He'd always considered himself tough, not easily rattled by being alone. But there was something different about tonight. The air felt thick, the kind of atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Then, through the veil of darkness ahead, something appeared. A figure, a man, standing by the side of the road, illuminated by the faint beams of David's headlights. At first, David thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he got closer, there was no mistaking it. There was someone standing there, completely still, with his thumb out, signaling for a ride. David's stomach churned. The man was just standing there, motionless, dressed in a dark, tattered jacket and old, worn-out jeans. His face was obscured by a hood, and his posture was unnervingly rigid. There was no car, no belongings, no sign of how he'd gotten there or where he'd come from. It was obscured that. David's first instinct was to keep driving. Picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? It felt like the setup to a horror movie, but something, perhaps the gnawing fear that his car would run out of gas, or maybe the thought that the man looked like he needed help, compelled David to slow down. He hesitated as his foot hovered over the brake pedal. The man wasn't moving, wasn't even reacting to David's approaching car. There was something unsettling about his stillness, but before David could think better of it, his car had already come to a stop next to the hitchhiker. He rolled down the passenger side window just enough to speak. "Hey, need a ride?" David's voice sounded louder than intended in the oppressive silence. The man didn't answer right away. For a moment, it seemed like he hadn't heard David at all. Then, slowly, almost too slowly, he turned his head to look directly at David. Even though his face was obscured by the hood, David could feel the intensity of the man's gaze, as if he was being sized up, examined. After what felt like an eternity, the man gave a small, barely perceptible nod. He moved toward the car, his steps unnaturally stiff and deliberate. The sound of the passenger door opening and closing seemed deafening in the quiet night. David couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine as the man settled into the seat beside him. The hitchhiker said nothing, didn't even bother to remove his hood. His hands rested limply in his lap, and he stared straight ahead, his posture unnervingly rigid. David cleared his throat, trying to dispel the tension that had filled the car. "So where you headed?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. The man didn't respond for several seconds, and David could feel his unease growing. Finally, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, the man muttered, "Just down the road." That answer did nothing to calm David's nerves. "Right," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat before pulling the car back onto the road. The silence in the car was oppressive. The hum of the engine and the faint sound of the tires on the pavement were the only noises cutting through the stillness. David glanced at the man from the corner of his eye. The hitchhiker hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring straight ahead. Something about his presence felt wrong, like he didn't quite belong in the world around him. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to shake the feeling of dread creeping up his spine. He stole another glance at the man. "You from around here?" he asked, hoping to break the silence. No response. David's unease deepened. He shifted in his seat, casting another nervous glance at the man beside him. The hitchhiker's hands rested in his lap, pale and bony, unmoving. The air inside the car felt cold, unnaturally so. David rubbed his arms, trying to dispel the chill that had settled over him, but it didn't help. It was as if the temperature had dropped the moment the man entered the car. The road stretched on endlessly, the towering trees on either side closing in like silent sentinels. David tried to focus on driving, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the silent figure beside him. Every now and then, he would steal a glance at the hitchhiker, but the man remained motionless, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the car, as if something or someone had struck the trunk. David jolted in his seat, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced nervously at the hitchhiker, but the man didn't react, didn't even flinch. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. David swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, more to himself than to the hitchhiker. The thud came again, louder this time. It sounded like someone was pounding on the trunk, desperate to get out. David's pulse quickened, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind them was empty. There was no one else there. The knocking continued, more insistent now. David's breath quickened, his mind racing. There was no way anyone could be in the trunk. He had checked before leaving, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was back there. David's grip on the wheel tightened as he tried to decide what to do. He could feel the hitchhiker's eyes on him now, though the man still hadn't moved or spoken. The pounding on the trunk grew louder, more frantic, sending a wave of dread crashing over David. I think I need to stop and check that out," David said, his voice shaky. The hitchhiker didn't respond. He just stared at David, his lips curling into a thin, eerie smile. David's blood ran cold. He slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The pounding on the trunk stopped the moment the car came to a halt, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. David sat there for a moment, his heart racing in his chest. He turned to the hitchhiker, who was now watching him intently, that unsettling smile still on his lips. I'll be right back," David stammered, fumbling with his seatbelt. He stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees around him, but the road remained eerily empty. David walked to the back of the car, his hands shaking as he reached for the trunk latch. He hesitated, dread pooling in his stomach. Something about this felt wrong. Everything in his gut told him to get back in the car and drive, but the persistent knocking was impossible to ignore. With a deep breath, David popped the trunk. It was empty. David blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The trunk was completely empty, no sign of anyone or anything. He stood there for a moment, dumbfounded. Had he imagined the knocking? Was his mind playing tricks on him? A sharp creak behind him made David whip around. The passenger door was open, and the hitchhiker was standing outside the car, watching him. David's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight of the man. The hitchhiker's hood had fallen back, revealing a gaunt, skeletal face. His skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull. His lips were twisted into that same eerie smile, but now it seemed more like a sneer, as if he knew something David didn't. David drove faster than he ever had before, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he raced away from the scene of the encounter. The headlights illuminated the winding road ahead, but the surrounding darkness seemed to loom closer, almost as if it had a mind of its own. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep within him. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected to see the hitchhiker's sinister grin staring back at him. The night felt alive, every rustle of leaves and distant howl of the wind magnified in his ears. "Just get to town," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Just a few more miles." But the road stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side becoming twisted and gnarled, their silhouettes appearing almost human in the dim light. David's mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened if he hadn't escaped, what the hitchhiker truly was. He had never believed in ghosts or urban legends, but now, as the memories of that encounter replayed in his mind, he felt a chilling realization wash over him. The hitchhiker hadn't just been a man. He was a specter of the road itself, a creature that thrived on the fear of those who dared to travel these darkened paths. David had unwittingly crossed into a realm where the rules of reality no longer applied. Just then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He glanced to the right, and his heart dropped. Standing on the edge of the road was a figure, a woman this time, her hand raised in a gesture of hope. She appeared lost, her clothes disheveled, and her eyes wide with desperation. Instinctively, David's heart sank. He hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake pedal. Should he stop? What if she was just another illusion? But the thought of leaving her there alone with the hitchhiker's curse was unbearable. With a deep breath, he slowed the car and rolled down the window, peering out into the night. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice shaky. The woman stepped closer, a look of relief washing over her face. "Please, I need help. My car broke down, and I've been waiting for hours." A flicker of recognition sparked in David's mind. She seemed familiar, as though he had seen her somewhere before. "What's your name?" he asked cautiously. "Emily," she replied, her voice trembling. "I swear, I just need to get to the next town. Can you take me?" He glanced behind him, paranoia creeping back in. What if this was another trap? I don't know. It's not safe out here. "Please." Emily's eyes pleaded with him. "I promise I'm just trying to get home. You can't leave me here." For a brief moment, David felt a surge of empathy for her plight. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, and he found himself longing for human connection amid the night's horrors. With a reluctant nod, he opened the door wider. "Okay, get in, but we have to go quickly." Emily scrambled into the passenger seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she slammed the door shut behind her. "Thank you," she gasped. "I thought I was going to be out there forever." As David pulled back onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. The air in the car felt heavy with tension, and he could sense something lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. "Where did your car break down?" he asked, trying to distract himself from the unease settling in his stomach. "A few miles back," she replied, her voice still shaky. "I was on my way to visit family, and suddenly the engine just died. I tried to flag down passing cars, but no one stopped. Then I thought I saw someone in the woods." David's heart raced at her words. "You didn't see anyone, did you?" "No, it was just shadows," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they felt alive." A chill ran down David's spine as he recalled the hitchhiker's words. "This road, it's haunted," he said, more to himself than to her. "There's something wrong with it." Emily turned to him, eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" "I picked up a hitchhiker earlier," he admitted, his voice trembling. He wasn't just a man. He was something else, something that feeds on fear." The realization hung in the air like a thick fog. The warmth of the car felt oppressive, and David could almost hear the whispers of the road beckoning them both deeper into its darkness. He glanced at Emily, noticing a flicker of fear cross her features. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. David slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. "No, no, no!" Emily screamed, her hands gripping the dashboard. The figure was the hitchhiker, standing tall and still as if waiting for them. David's heart raced, panic setting in as he realized they were trapped. "What do we do?" Emily cried, looking frantically from the hitchhiker to David. "Stay calm," he urged, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll turn around." He shifted the car into reverse, but before he could move, the hitchhiker stepped closer, his face obscured by shadows. David could feel the weight of his presence pressing in on them, suffocating and dark. "You can't escape," the hitchhiker said, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the night. "You've already invited me into your lives." "David," Emily screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "What does he mean?" With a surge of adrenaline, David spun the wheel, trying to veer off the road. But the hitchhiker raised his hand, and the car came to an abrupt halt, as if caught in an invisible web. "I've watched you both," the hitchhiker continued, stepping closer until his face was illuminated by the headlights. His eyes glinted with malevolence. "I thrive on fear, and you have so much of it to give." David's breath quickened, panic rising within him. "Let us go," he shouted, gripping the steering wheel as if it could save them. But the hitchhiker merely smiled, his teeth gleaming in the darkness. "You don't understand. You are part of the road now. You will never leave." In a moment of desperation, David pressed down hard on the gas pedal, and the car jolted forward, narrowly avoiding the hitchhiker as he dove back onto the asphalt. The engine roared to life, and David's pulse raced with a mixture of fear and hope. "Hold on," he shouted, the night air rushing in as they sped past the hitchhiker, who stood in the rearview mirror, his figure fading into the darkness. Emily gasped as they flew down the highway, the trees blurring into a dark tunnel around them. "We have to get out of here," she cried, her voice shaking. As they drove, David felt a strange sensation, as if the road itself was shifting beneath them. Shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of his vision, taunting him with memories of the hitchhiker's words. They were not free yet. "Just keep driving," Emily urged, her voice rising in panic. "We have to get away." But as the road twisted ahead, the headlights flickered, and David could see the faint outline of another figure appearing in the distance. His heart sank as he realized they were not alone on this road. "More of them?" he murmured, his grip tightening on the wheel. "What are they?" "More of them?" he murmured, his grip tightening on the wheel. "What are they?" Emily turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but we have to get past them." With determination, David pressed on the gas, willing the car to speed up. As they approached the figures, David could see them more clearly, ghostly forms, lost souls trapped in a never-ending cycle of despair. They reached out toward the car, their faces twisted in agony. "No, keep your eyes on the road," David shouted, trying to block out the horror around them. But the road was changing again, shifting into a dark tunnel that threatened to swallow them whole. David felt the car lurch as the tires lost traction on the asphalt, the engine sputtering ominously. "Hold on," he shouted, gripping the wheel with every ounce of strength he had left. The car barreled forward, and as they approached the end of the tunnel, a blinding light engulfed them, illuminating the darkness with a radiant glow. David squinted against the brightness, unsure of what lay ahead. With one final push, he pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the car surging forward. They broke through the light, and suddenly, everything changed. They were back on a familiar road, the sun rising in the distance. The hitchhiker, the figures, the darkness, it all vanished behind them, leaving only the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. David looked at Emily, disbelief etched on his face. Did we escape?" Emily blinked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I think we did. But what was that?" "I don't know," David admitted, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "But whatever it was, we survived." As they drove into the dawn, the road before them felt lighter, the darkness receding. But deep down, they both knew they had crossed into a realm where shadows lingered, and the hitchhiker might not be gone for good. The haunting memory would remain, a constant reminder of the perils that lurked along those twisted roads. They had escaped, but the true test was just beginning. The terrifying ride. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate highway. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the faint sound of crickets began to fill the evening silence. Emily Turner had always loved night drives, but tonight was different. The ominous clouds overhead threatened rain, and the darkness seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite place. Her old sedan creaked as she navigated the winding road through the dense forest. Emily had just finished a long shift at the diner in town and was eager to get home. The radio played softly in the background, a low murmur of static and distant country tunes, a comforting presence amid the encroaching gloom. As she drove, a flicker of movement caught her eye on the roadside. A figure stood there, illuminated briefly by her headlights, a hitchhiker. He was dressed in a tattered black jacket, his face obscured by the shadows. Her heart raced. Picking up strangers was against everything her parents had taught her. But something in the way he stood there, his thumb outstretched, made her pause. She slowed her car, hesitating. The rain began to fall lightly, tapping against the windshield like a quiet plea. "Come on, Em, it's just a ride," she muttered to herself. After all, he looked harmless, just a weary traveler caught in the storm. With a deep breath, she rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The hitchhiker leaned closer, his features becoming clearer. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "Yeah, thanks," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been waiting out here for hours." Emily unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, shaking the rain from his hair. "I'm Jake," he said, offering a hand. She hesitated before shaking it, feeling an unexpected chill run through her. "Emily," she replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just trying to get to the next town," he said, glancing out the window. "You know how it is. This road can be a bit lonely." Emily nodded, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up her spine. "Yeah, it's pretty quiet out here." As she drove on, the rain began to pour, drumming against the roof of the car. The landscape transformed into a blur of darkness and shadows, the trees leaning closer as if eavesdropping on their conversation. She tried to engage Jake in small talk, but he responded in clipped sentences, his gaze fixed outside. "I just got out of a bad situation," he finally admitted, his voice distant. "Needed to get away. You ever feel like you're being watched?" The question sent a shiver down her spine. "Not really," she said, forcing a laugh. "But I guess it's easy to feel that way out here." "Trust me, you should be careful," he said, turning to meet her gaze. "You never know what's lurking in the shadows." Emily tried to brush off his words, but they clung to her like the humidity in the air. The trees seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, and the wind howled through the open window, carrying an unsettling whisper that sent chills racing down her arms. "Are you okay?" she asked, breaking the tense silence. Jake turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm just tired. Long night." They drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Emily stole glances at him, her unease growing. His skin was paler than she remembered, and there was something about the way he shifted in his seat, as if he were constantly on edge. Suddenly, the headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. Emily's heart raced as she pulled over to the side of the road, panic rising in her chest. No, not now," she muttered, turning the key in the ignition again. The engine groaned, but wouldn't start. Emily's mind raced as she glanced at Jake, who remained eerily calm, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "Do you have any idea what's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Just give it a minute," he replied, his tone oddly soothing. "It'll start up again. Just breathe." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But the night felt oppressive, and the shadows around the car seemed to close in. She fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal. "Great," she muttered, frustration boiling over. "Hey, it's going to be okay," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just trust me." Before she could respond, a loud bang echoed in the distance, making them both jump. Emily's heart raced. "What was that?" "Just the wind," he assured her. Or maybe a branch falling. It happens. But Emily felt a deep sense of foreboding. The woods felt alive, and every rustle seemed like a warning. She glanced at Jake again, studying his face. There was something unsettling about his calm demeanor, as if he knew more than he was letting on. After a few moments, after the engine finally roared back to life, the headlights flickering back on. "See? Told you," Jake said, a hint of a smile creeping onto his lips. "Right," she replied, not sure whether to feel relieved or even more anxious. She pulled back onto the road, the tires crunching against gravel. But the relief was short-lived. As she drove, she noticed that the trees were thicker here, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The rain continued to pour, obscuring her vision, and every so often, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement just outside the window. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Trust me," Jake said, his tone now laced with an edge of urgency. "Just keep driving." Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't like this. I think I should turn back." Suddenly, a flicker of light caught her eye in the distance. A car, headlights beaming. Relief washed over her. "Look, a car!" Jake's expression shifted instantly, his gaze hardening. "No, don't stop. Keep going." "What?" Emily's heart raced. "Why not?" "Just trust me," he insisted, panic creeping into his voice. "You don't want to get involved with them." Before she could respond, the headlights disappeared, swallowed by the trees. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. The rain continued to fall, and the oppressive darkness closed in around them. "I think I need to pull over," Emily finally said, feeling her chest tighten with anxiety. "I can't keep driving like this." "No," Jake shouted, grabbing her arm. "You can't stop. They'll find us if you do." His grip sent a shock of fear coursing through her. "Find us? Who are you talking about?" Jake's eyes darted around, as if he were searching for something in the shadows. "You don't understand. They're out here. They're always watching." "Who?" Emily's voice trembled. "You're scaring me." But before he could answer, the engine began to sputter again, the headlights flickering ominously. "No, not now!" Emily cried, slamming her fist against the dashboard. Jake leaned forward, his expression fierce. "We have to go. Now!" Desperate, Emily pressed on the gas pedal, willing the car to move faster. The tires slipped on the wet road, and her heart raced as she navigated the twists and turns. The forest around them felt alive, the trees closing in, and the shadows danced menacingly just beyond the reach of the headlights. Suddenly, she spotted another figure standing on the side of the road. A woman, drenched and pale, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. Emily's heart sank. "Do you see her?" "Don't stop," Jake yelled, his voice echoing with urgency. But the woman raised her hand, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please, I need help." Emily's instincts screamed at her to pull over, but Jake's grip tightened on her arm, his eyes wild. "Keep driving. You can't stop for her." With her heart pounding, Emily pressed on the gas, racing past the woman. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woman standing there, her expression morphing from desperation to anger. The road ahead darkened, and Emily felt a cold sweat break out on her brow. "What the hell is happening?" she gasped. "Just keep going." Jake insisted, his voice strained. "We need to get out of here." Emily's mind raced. Who was this man? What had she gotten herself into? She stole another glance at him. The fear in his eyes mirrored her own, and she felt a pang of empathy. "Jake, please, you need to tell me what's going on." Before he could respond, the headlights flickered again, plunging them into darkness. The car shuddered, the engine sputtering violently. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Come on, start," she pleaded, turning the key frantically. The engine groaned, and in the distance she could see figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glinting in the darkness. Emily's heart raced as she slammed the key down again. "Please, please!" Jake's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the calm stranger, but a man teetering on the edge of panic. "You have to go! They'll catch us if you don't!" With one final turn of the key, the engine roared to life, and the headlights flickered back on. Emily's pulse quickened as she slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching against the asphalt. As they tore down the road, the figures in the trees seemed to multiply, shadowy forms darting between the trunks. Emily's breath quickened as fear coursed through her veins. What do they want? Who are they? They want us, Jake shouted, glancing back. They'll stop at nothing. With every turn, Emily felt the weight of the darkness pressing in, the trees looming closer as if they were alive, intent on trapping her. The shadows began to blur together, and the road ahead twisted into an inky blackness. In a moment of desperation, Emily made a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt road, the tires kicking up mud as she navigated the treacherous path. "I have to lose them," she exclaimed, her voice tinged with terror. But the dirt road only led deeper into the woods, the trees closing in on all sides. The headlights illuminated a clearing ahead, and Emily's heart sank as she realized she had driven into a dead end. She slammed the brakes, skidding to a halt. "Get out," Jake urged, his voice now filled with urgency. "What? Are you crazy?" But before she could protest, he flung open the door and jumped out into the rain-soaked darkness. "We have to go, now!" The figures from the trees closed in, shadows merging into one grotesque form. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but fear rooted her to the spot. She hesitated for just a moment before following Jake into the dark. The forest was alive with sound, branches snapping beneath their feet as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The rain poured down around them, turning the ground into a treacherous mudslide. Emily's lungs burned as she stumbled over roots and rocks, and then glancing back to see the figures emerging from the shadows, their movements impossibly quick. She didn't know what they were, but a primal fear ignited within her. "Keep going," Jake yelled, his voice slicing through the cacophony of the night. As they ran, the trees seemed to reach out, their branches clawing at her arms. Emily could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent just behind them, chasing them through the twisted forest. A flash of lightning illuminated the path ahead, and she caught a glimpse of a figure standing among the trees, watching with hollow eyes. It sent a jolt of terror through her. "Where are we going?" she shouted, desperation creeping into her voice. "To the cabin. We'll be safe there," Jake replied, determination etched into his features. A cabin? The thought felt both hopeful and terrifying. They pushed onward, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they stumbled through the underbrush. The shadows danced around them, and Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Finally, they broke through the trees into a small clearing. In the center stood a decrepit cabin, its windows shattered and the door hanging askew. The sight sent chills down Emily's spine. "Is this it?" "Yes," Jake said, urgency lacing his voice. "We can hide inside." Without waiting for a response, he rushed to the door, flinging it open and beckoning her inside. Emily hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. As she crossed the threshold, the darkness enveloped her. The air inside was thick and musty, filled with the scent of damp wood. Jake slammed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy bolt. "What now?" Emily gasped, trying to catch her breath. "Just stay quiet," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to wait them out." Emily nodded, straining to listen as the rain hammered against the roof. The sound echoed through the cabin, drowning out her racing heart. But the silence was shattered by a loud crash outside, the door shuddering under the force of something heavy slamming against it. "What was that?" she breathed, her voice trembling. Jake glanced around the dimly lit room, searching for something, anything, to defend themselves with. "I don't know, but we need to be ready." The cabin felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in as the sounds of chaos erupted outside. Shouts and growls mingled with the rain, a cacophony of madness that made Emily's skin crawl. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, the heavy wood groaning under the weight of whatever was trying to get in. "We can't let them in," Jake shouted, pushing against the door with all his strength. With every tremor, Emily felt the walls of her sanity start to crack. "Who are they?" she cried, panic rising in her throat. "They want us to join them," Jake shouted, his voice raw with terror. "They don't let anyone leave." The realization washed over Emily like ice water. Join them? What do you mean? But before he could respond, the door splintered and a dark shape burst through, flooding the cabin with an unearthly chill. Jake turned to Emily, eyes wide with horror. "Run!" he screamed, but it was too late. The figure stepped into the cabin, a grotesque silhouette against the pale light. Its features were twisted and inhuman, eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. Emily's scream echoed through the night as she stumbled backward, colliding with the wall. The creature advanced, its breath a rancid mix of decay and malice. Jake pushed her aside, a wild desperation igniting within him. "Get out!" he yelled, shoving her toward a window. But Emily was frozen in place, her mind racing. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. She had picked up a hitchhiker who led her into a trap. She should have listened to her instincts. With one last surge of courage, Jake lunged at the creature, a desperate attempt to buy Emily time. "Go, I'll hold it off. I'll hold it off." Emily's heart shattered as she turned to the window, feeling the world around her spiral into chaos. She could hear the struggle behind her, Jake's cries mingling with the creature's snarls. Summoning every ounce of strength, she threw herself against the window, shattering the glass. Pain shot through her arm, but she didn't stop. She crawled through the jagged hole, tears streaming down her face as she hit the ground outside. The rain soaked her instantly, but she couldn't stop. She had to run. She pushed herself up and sprinted into the night, the forest closing in around her as she fled from the nightmare behind her. Every step felt like a battle against the darkness, branches tearing at her skin as she stumbled through the underbrush. She could still hear the sounds of chaos behind her, the creature's growls mixing with Jake's desperate shouts. "Help, please!" she cried into the void, her voice breaking as she pushed herself forward. But the woods swallowed her cries, and the shadows seemed to mock her efforts. She didn't know how long she ran, panic driving her deeper into the night, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her limbs. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, collapsing to the ground. The rain pounded around her, but she didn't care. She was alive. But the relief was short-lived. As she lay there, gasping for breath, the shadows began to shift again, creeping toward her with an ominous purpose. "Emily," a voice echoed through the trees, Jake's voice, but distorted, as if it were coming from the depths of the forest. "No, stay away," she screamed, scrambling to her feet. But the shadows were closing in, the darkness thickening as the figures from before materialized in the moonlight. They were more than just shadows. They were the lost souls of the forest, trapped and twisted, their faces contorted in eternal despair. Emily's heart raced as she realized she was surrounded. "Get away from me," she shouted, but the shadows advanced, whispering in an ancient language that echoed in her mind. "Join us," they hissed, their voices a chorus of torment. "No. No," she screamed, her voice breaking. "I won't." But as the figures closed in, she felt their icy fingers brush against her skin, dragging her into the depths of despair. In that moment, she understood the truth. The hitchhiker was not just a man, but a harbinger of doom, leading her into the very heart of darkness. Pombre. And as the shadows engulfed her, she knew that she would never escape. The last passenger. Maya had always loved night drives, the empty roads cutting through desolate stretches of countryside. The peace, the quiet, those were her moments of escape. She enjoyed the freedom, feeling the hum of the engine beneath her and the soft, whispering sound of wind as it raced by. Tonight, however, something felt off. It was just after midnight, and she was driving down a road she hadn't taken before. She had been following the map on her phone for what felt like hours, though her destination, a quaint little inn she had found online, was nowhere to be seen. Her phone's GPS had started flickering an hour ago, and now it was completely dead. There was no signal either, leaving her stranded on this seemingly endless road. Her stomach twisted with unease. Ahead, a sign emerged from the darkness, its words barely visible in the dull light of her headlights. Last exit, 20 miles. She sighed in frustration. Just then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure standing at the side of the road, right in the narrow strip between her car and the trees that lined the highway. A man, his arm raised in a hitchhiking gesture. Maya slowed down instinctively, her heart racing. Who was hitchhiking at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? As she passed him, her headlights illuminated his face. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat despite the warm summer air, his face pale and his eyes hollow. A deep pit formed in her stomach, and she pressed the gas pedal harder, deciding against stopping. Several miles passed, and she kept looking into her rearview mirror, expecting to see him vanish in the distance. But then, there he was again. Her blood turned cold. The same man, standing by the road, his thumb out, his hollow gaze piercing her, even through the dark. It was impossible. There were no other exits, no side roads he could have taken. How could he be ahead of her? Maya gripped the steering wheel tightly, refusing to stop. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting back to the mirror. He disappeared behind her once more, but something told her this wasn't over. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky. She hadn't noticed the storm clouds that were rolling in, casting an even deeper gloom over the road. A flash of lightning revealed the man again, this time standing in the middle of the road just ahead of her. She slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest as the car screeched to a stop inches away from him. She froze, her eyes locked onto his. He stood there, unmoving, as though daring her to get out. Her skin crawled with fear, and for a moment, she considered reversing and getting the hell out of there. But before she could react, he walked around to the passenger side door and opened it without hesitation, climbing in. "Drive," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the door shutting with a quiet thud. Maya's pulse raced. She stared straight ahead, hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but something about him felt inevitable, as though she had no choice but to comply. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain that had begun to pour down. "Doesn't matter," he replied, his eyes fixed ahead. "Just drive and don't stop." The command sent chills down her spine, but she did as he said. She drove, the darkness closing in around them as the rain lashed against the windshield. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, the road disappearing into the inky blackness beyond the reach of her headlights. The man sat in silence, his presence suffocating. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his face hidden in the shadows. But Maya could feel him watching her, his eyes burning into her. After what felt like hours, the man finally broke the silence. "They don't like the light, you know." Maya glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "The things in the dark. They don't like the light." Her stomach twisted in knots. What was he talking about? She had the overwhelming urge to pull over, to demand answers. But the man's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't stop." The road twisted ahead, and as they rounded a bend, her headlights caught something moving in the distance. A shape, several shapes. It looked like animals at first, hunched over and crawling on all fours. But as they got closer, Maya realized these things were not animals at all. They were humanoid, with long, twisted limbs and glowing, empty eyes that locked onto the car as it approached. Their mouths opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. One of them lunged toward the car, slamming its body against the passenger side door. Maya screamed, swerving to avoid it as the creature let out an ear-piercing screech. "Keep driving," the man growled, his tone commanding. "Don't stop." Her hands were shaking violently now, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. She didn't know what those things were, but the thought of stopping, of letting them catch up, sent waves of terror crashing over her. The road seemed endless, the creatures pacing the car, their bodies illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. The rain was relentless, blurring everything outside the car into one terrifying mass of darkness. Maya's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, refusing to slow down. "What are they?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. The man was silent for a long moment before responding. They're the ones who didn't make it. Her heart sank. Didn't make it? Make it where? They were like you once, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. On the road, driving, lost, but they didn't listen. Maya's stomach lurched. She couldn't understand what he meant, but every instinct told her that if she stopped, she would join them. The things outside slammed into the car again, their screeches filling the night air. Just ahead, a dim glow appeared through the rain, a sign of some kind. She squinted through the water running down the windshield. The words "final exit" flashed before the sign disappeared into the rearview mirror. The man shifted slightly, his eyes glancing toward the glow. "You have one last chance," he said, his voice cold. "Once you pass the final exit, there's no going back." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't stop. Not now. The man leaned forward, his hollow eyes locking onto her. "Make your choice, but make it soon." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she pressed down on the gas pedal, the final exit growing closer. The creatures outside were shrieking louder, their twisted bodies keeping pace with the car. As she sped past the sign, a terrible guttural growl rose from the darkness behind her. The things that had chased her suddenly stopped, retreating into the blackness as if they were forbidden from crossing the threshold. Maya glanced at the man in the passenger seat, but he was gone. The seat was empty, the door closed, as if he had never been there at all. She kept driving, tears streaming down her face, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The road stretched out ahead of her, empty and endless, but now she was completely alone. The silent woods. Jake's truck rumbled along the isolated dirt road, its headlights slicing through the pitch-black night. His hands were tense on the wheel as the trees on either side grew thicker, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal arms. This was no ordinary forest. It was the Silent Woods, so named for the eerie, unnatural quiet that lingered there. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. Just silence. He had heard the rumors about the place, tales passed down from locals about people disappearing, strange sounds, and sightings of something lurking in the woods. But Jake was a skeptic. He worked as a freelance photographer, always chasing that next story, that perfect shot. When he'd heard about the Silent Woods, he thought it would make for a great series, showcase the strange and eerie atmosphere, and maybe dispel the ridiculous myths once and for all. After hours of driving and nothing but darkness around him, Jake finally saw the old cabin, a flickering glow from its single window signaling the end of his journey. He'd rented it from an old man who lived in town, the only place to stay in this remote part of the forest. The man had warned him, of course. "You best be leaving at the first light," the old man had said, his eyes dark and serious. Silent woods don't take kindly to strangers lingering after dark. Jake had laughed it off then, but now, staring at the cabin and the oppressive woods that surrounded it, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He grabbed his camera bag, his flashlight, and the food supplies he had packed, then stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his jacket. The forest loomed over him, the trees taller than he'd imagined, the silence deafening. He could hear his own breath, his heartbeat, the crunch of the gravel beneath his boots, but beyond that, nothing. After settling into the small, musty cabin, Jake set out to scout the area. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in shadow. His flashlight beam barely pierced the blackness, but it was enough to capture the edges of trees and broken branches. With his camera ready, he started snapping pictures. The silence was unsettling, more intense than he had anticipated. No wind, no distant hoot of an owl. It was as though the forest had swallowed every sound, trapping it within the towering trees. As he ventured deeper into the woods, Jake's unease grew. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to go to the safety of the cabin. But he pushed forward, determined to shake off his irrational fear. There was nothing out here, just trees and shadows. Then he heard it. A soft rustling behind him, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. He stopped, listening, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The rustling stopped too. He turned around, the light sweeping across the trees, illuminating nothing but bark and brambles. Jake shook his head, laughing nervously to himself. "It's just nerves," he muttered, pressing forward. But as he moved, so did the rustling. It wasn't an animal. He was certain of that. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated, following his every step. He stopped again, this time whipping around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing, only darkness. His skin crawled, and his pulse quickened. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Determined not to be rattled by the dark, he pushed on. Yet the feeling of being watched, followed, grew stronger. His mind started racing, conjuring images of the things the locals had warned him about. Dark shapes, figures in the woods, stalking those who dared enter after nightfall. His flashlight flickered, then dimmed. Jake froze. No, he muttered, tapping it desperately. The light sputtered back to life for a moment, then blinked out entirely, plunging him into absolute darkness. For a long moment, he stood completely still, holding his breath, listening. And then he heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it was closer, much closer. His heart hammered against his chest as his eyes strained to adjust to the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches twisting like claws in the shadows. "Hello," Jake called, his voice cracking with fear. The silence swallowed his words, offering no echo, no response. Suddenly, something cold brushed against the back of his neck. Jake yelped, spinning around, only to find empty space. His breathing was ragged now, panic setting in. He had to get back to the cabin. He had to get out of these woods. He started walking quickly, trying to remember which direction he had come from, but everything looked the same. His mind was a blur, his feet stumbling over roots and stones. The rustling followed, louder now, as though something was rushing through the trees, closing in on him. He broke into a run, his legs pumping, his breath coming in short gasps. Branches whipped at his face, his arms, but he didn't care. He had to get out. He had to. A shadow darted across his path, just ahead. Jake skidded to a halt, his heart slamming against his ribcage. He could barely make out the shape, a tall, dark figure standing just beyond the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the pitch-black night. The figure moved toward him, slow and deliberate. Jake turned and ran in the opposite direction, not caring where he was going, only that he needed to escape. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. The rustling followed, faster now, accompanied by faint, heavy breathing, as though whatever was chasing him was closing in. The cabin, it came into view, its dim glow barely visible through the trees. Jake surged forward, hope rising in his chest. But just as he reached the clearing, something cold and sharp grabbed his ankle, yanking him to the ground. He hit the dirt hard, his head spinning, pain shooting through his body. He scrambled to his feet, but whatever had grabbed him still held tight, dragging him backward. He kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The force was too strong, pulling him into the shadows. And then he saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, eyes hollow and black, lips twisted into a grotesque smile. The thing was human, or it had been once. But now it was something else, something monstrous. Its fingers dug into his skin, sharp as knives, its breath rancid and cold. Jake screamed, his voice echoing through the silent woods. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the figure's smile growing wider, its eyes gleaming with hunger. The next morning, the old man from town drove out to the cabin to check on Jake, as he had promised. But when he arrived, the truck was there, parked and untouched, the cabin door wide open. He called out for Jake but received no answer. The old man knew better than to step into the woods. He had seen too many people vanish without a trace. With a heavy sigh, he got back into his car and drove away, leaving the silent woods to claim its newest victim. No one ever found Jake's body. Just like the others before him, he had disappeared, becoming another story, another warning for those foolish enough to venture into the silent woods after dark. But sometimes, on quiet nights, you can still hear the rustling of leaves in the windless air, and the faint, desperate cry of someone who never made it out. The terror on Raven Trail. I just wanted a peaceful weekend, a break from work, people, and the constant noise. The past few months had been a relentless grind, and I craved solitude. So I decided to head out for a quick camping trip. I found this place online, a remote spot called Raven Trail, tucked away deep in the forests of Oregon. The site was advertised as quiet, isolated, and far enough off the beaten path to guarantee solitude, perfect for what I needed. I left early in the morning, and by mid-afternoon I was there. The drive to Raven Trail was eerie in itself. The highway gradually disappeared into a winding dirt road, trees towering on either side, their branches knitting together overhead. There was no one around, no other cars, no hikers, no one. I finally reached the clearing. It was a small patch of land surrounded by dense forest, and I could just barely hear the distant hum of a river somewhere far off. It was perfect, just me and nature. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire pit, and began to settle in for what I thought would be a relaxing weekend. But as I unpacked, something caught my eye. A metallic glint in the grass near the base of a tree. At first I thought it was trash, maybe an old beer can left by a careless camper. But when I bent down to pick it up, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small camera, the kind you see used for wildlife tracking, except it wasn't mounted to anything. It just lay there, half buried in the dirt, facing directly toward my campsite. I figured maybe someone had dropped it or forgotten it, so I picked it up. That's when I saw the tiny red light blinking on the side. The camera was on. Everything was being filmed. My first instinct was to drop it, but curiosity got the better of me. I examined it closely. It was a modern, high-tech model, and it was actively recording. My stomach churned. Why? Why would someone set up a camera in the middle of the forest, right where I was camping? It did not make any sense at all. Everything pointed towards something sinister. I told myself it was nothing, a misplaced wildlife camera, or maybe part of a research project. But still, something about it felt off. I was not convinced at all with my self-conviction effort. Then I saw another one. This one was up in a tree, cleverly hidden, its lens aimed directly at me. Now it was as clear as daylight. The object of the recording was me. My heart began to race. 2 cameras. What were the chances? This wasn't just an accident. I was being watched. I was sure about that. The burning question was, by who and why? Why would someone want to watch me, stalk me? What were his or their intentions? I quickly glanced around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The wind rustled the leaves, but otherwise, everything was still. Too still. I shoved the camera into my backpack and walked the perimeter of my campsite, my nerves on edge. That's when I noticed a third camera, this one farther back in the woods, almost hidden under a pile of leaves. Someone had deliberately placed these cameras here. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the rational part of my brain kept whispering that I was overreacting. Maybe it was some weird prank or a forgotten research project. I decided to stay, just for one night. I would keep an eye out and leave first thing in the morning. But as I sat by the campfire later that evening, the unease wouldn't go away. The sun had set, and the sky was an angry swirl of dark clouds, threatening a storm. The wind had picked up, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled through the trees. The fire crackled, but the warmth did little to calm my nerves. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the forest, like the sound of a branch breaking. I froze. The sound was too close. I strained to hear anything else, but there was only the rustling of leaves in the growing wind. Then, another snap, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Someone was out there. I shot up from the fire, my eyes darting toward the tree line. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, half hidden by the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. "Hey, who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move an inch. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared, trying to make out any details. But all I could see was the silhouette, barely visible in the dim light of the fire. Thunder cracked, and suddenly the sky opened up. Rain began to pour down in heavy sheets, dousing the fire and plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. I scrambled to grab my flashlight, fumbling with it as water soaked through my clothes. When I finally switched it on and pointed it toward the trees, the figure was gone. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. The cameras, the figure, something was very wrong. I quickly gathered my things, shoving them haphazardly into my backpack. My hands trembled as I tried to pack up my tent, the rain making everything slippery and difficult to handle. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. I swung the flashlight around, my breath catching in my throat. The beam of light caught a glimpse of movement. Another figure, this one just a few feet away, standing at the edge of the clearing. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a split second, and I saw them clearly. Two figures, their faces obscured by the shadows, standing there in the pouring rain. Panic surged through me. I abandoned my tent, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted toward my car, slipping in the mud as I went. The rain was coming down so hard now that I could barely see, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I reached the car, threw my gear in the back, and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get the key into the ignition. After what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the clearing, my tires slipping on the wet dirt road. As I sped down the narrow trail, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures chasing after me. But there was nothing. Just the rain and the dark, winding road. My heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town miles away, drenched and exhausted. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I don't know who those people were or why they were watching me. I don't know what they wanted, and frankly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never set foot on Raven Trail or any other secluded camping spot ever again. The Creature of Blackthorn Hill. My name is Nolan Winters, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in 1998. I was 27, living in a quiet little town called Blackthorn Hill, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Blackthorn Hill was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life moved slowly. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up trucks and snowmobiles. On weekends, I enjoyed hiking and fishing in the woods that surrounded the town. It was a peaceful life, until that summer. It was late July when the tranquility of Blackthorn Hill was shattered by the disappearance of a visitor. His name was Aaron Keene, a journalist from New York who'd come to write an article about small-town life. He'd been in Blackthorn Hill for about a week, chatting with the locals and soaking in the mountain air. Then one morning, Aaron set off for a hike up to Hawk's Talon Ridge and never returned. I didn't know Aaron well, but we'd shared a few beers at the local bar, the Rusty Axe, a couple of nights before he vanished. He seemed like a decent guy, curious, full of stories about the places he'd been. His disappearance unnerved everyone in town, and soon enough, search parties were organized to comb the woods for any sign of him. A week after Aaron went missing, Sheriff Caldwell called me. Given my familiarity with the terrain, he asked if I could help with the search. I agreed, figuring it was the least I could do. The next morning, I met up with a small search party at the edge of the forest, about 10 of us, including the sheriff, his deputy, and 2 of Aaron's friends who had come from New York. We split into pairs to cover more ground. I was teamed up with a guy named Carl, big, broad-shouldered, and always wearing a flannel shirt like he just stepped out of a logging camp. Carl was a longtime friend, and the 2 of us had spent more time together in these woods than I could count. As we headed up the trail, the familiar scent of pine and wet earth filled the air. But the silence that hung over the forest that day, it wasn't the usual peaceful quiet. It was oppressive, heavy, with something I couldn't quite name. We'd been hiking for a few hours when we came across something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a patch of ground where the underbrush had been flattened, like something or someone had fallen there. Nearby, a piece of torn fabric hung on a thorn bush. It looked like it might have come from Aaron's jacket. Clathed. We called out for him, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. We marked the spot and radioed the sheriff. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead, and the forest grew darker. Not wanting to get caught in a storm, Carl and I decided to take a different route back, hoping to cover some new ground. That's when we found something I'll never forget. A cave. The entrance was barely visible, hidden by a thick tangle of vines. We might have walked right past it if Carl hadn't spotted it. It wasn't wide, just big enough for a person to slip through. We exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing. Maybe Aaron had taken shelter here, but the unease in my gut told me we shouldn't go in. "Think he's in there?" I asked, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Only one way to find out," Carl said, pulling out his flashlight. We ducked into the cave, Carl's flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. It was cold inside, the air damp and stale. We moved cautiously, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. After a few minutes, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber. That's when we saw it, Aaron's body. He was sprawled on the cold stone floor, his face drained of all color, eyes wide open in an expression of sheer terror. His clothes were torn, and there were deep, jagged scratches all over his arms and neck. But it wasn't just the sight of his body that made my blood run cold. It was the thing standing over him. At first, I thought it was a man, a tall figure hunched over Aaron's lifeless body. But as Carl's flashlight beam settled on it, I realized with horror that it was something else entirely. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched thin over its bony frame. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in fingers that looked more like claws. And its eyes, sickly yellow, glowing in the dark like the eyes of a predator. Carl let out a low curse, backing up a step. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "But we need to get out of here." We moved slowly at first, not wanting to draw its attention. But as soon as we reached the cave's narrow entrance, we ran. The rain had started by the time we got outside, but we didn't stop. We didn't speak. We just ran, as fast as we could, until we were back at the trailhead. When we finally caught our breath, we radioed the sheriff. He arrived with his deputies a few minutes later. Carl and I told them what we'd seen, but when the sheriff and his men returned from the cave, they claimed there was no sign of the creature. They found Aaron's body, all right, but whatever had been standing over him was gone. The sheriff urged us to keep quiet about what we saw. He didn't want to cause a panic, said it was probably just an animal attack. But I knew better. So did Carl. In the days that followed, life in Blackthorn Hill returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the town felt different, tenser, more cautious. People didn't go hiking as much anymore. Kids weren't allowed to roam the woods freely. The local businesses suffered as fewer tourists came through. Then, a few weeks later, another hiker went missing. This time, it was a young woman named Alice, a local. They found her body in a different part of the woods, mutilated in the same way as Aaron's. Once again, the sheriff called it an animal attack, but by then the whole town was on edge. Karen was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I started having nightmares, always the same thing. Those yellow eyes, staring at me from the dark. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the memory of that cave never far from my mind. One evening, Carl showed up at my house. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Dark circles under his eyes, his face pale. He sat down on my porch, lit a cigarette, and stared off into the distance for a long time before speaking. "I've been seeing it," he said quietly. "Out in the woods, not up close, but I catch glimpses. It's still out there, Nolan." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. The next day, we went to Sheriff Caldwell, told him what Carl had seen and what I'd been dreaming about. The sheriff was skeptical, but he agreed to help us organize one last search, just the three of us. We set out at dawn, rifles slung over our shoulders, flashlights in hand, and ventured deep into the woods, back to that cursed cave. When we got there, the air inside was colder than before. As we stepped into the larger chamber, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The creature. This time, we didn't run. We raised our rifles, but before we could fire, the thing moved, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It lunged at Carl, knocking him to the ground. The sheriff and I opened fire, the shots echoing in the cave like thunder. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and collapsed. We didn't stick around to see if it was dead. We grabbed Carl and got out of there as fast as we could. I haven't been back to Blackthorn Hill since. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about those yellow eyes watching from the dark. The Hunter's Nightmare. My name is Owen Gray Hawk, and this event still haunts me. It was in 2013, and I was living on the northern Blackfoot Reservation in Montana. Growing up on the reservation, we were immersed in stories of spirits, creatures, and strange happenings. Some were meant to teach lessons, but others, those were the ones that made your skin crawl. My life was simple, filled with family traditions, hunting trips, and the occasional village gathering. But that summer, something far from simple happened. It started when I got a call from my old friend Derek Red Cloud. We hadn't spoken much since high school, but he knew about my hunting skills and tracking experience. He invited me on a hunting trip with a few of his friends in the Bitterroot Mountains. I figured it would be a nice break, a chance to reconnect with Derek and enjoy the wilderness, so I agreed. Early one morning, Derek pulled up in his beat-up pickup truck, and we hit the road. The drive was long, taking us deep into the forested mountains, but the conversation flowed easily. We talked about our lives, the old days, and the things that changed since we'd last seen each other. After a few hours, we met up with his friends, Ben and Tom, at a remote gas station. Ben was a quiet, serious type, while Tom, on the other hand, was the clown, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. We continued driving, leaving the main road for a narrow dirt path that twisted through the thick trees. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. After what seemed like an eternity, we reached a clearing where we decided to set up camp. The plan was to spend a few days hunting deer, but Derek mentioned that wild turkeys were also abundant in the area. The first day went without incident. We scouted the area, set up some trail cameras, and enjoyed a night around the campfire. We shared stories, mostly about life, a few about strange things we'd heard growing up on the reservation. There was an eerie calm to the forest. It was so quiet that you could hear the faintest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire. We laughed it off and went to bed, but I had a strange feeling in my gut. The next morning, we split up into pairs. Derek and Ben went one way, while Tom and I took another trail. We walked for hours, following tracks and looking for signs of game, but the animals seemed to be hiding. As the sun dipped low in the sky, we started making our way back to camp. That's when it happened. A scream echoed through the trees. A human scream, not an animal's cry. Tom and I exchanged a glance and ran toward the sound. As we got closer, the trees seemed to close in, the light fading quicker than it should. When we finally burst into the clearing, we found Derek and Ben standing over something. I couldn't see clearly at first, but as I moved closer, my stomach twisted. It was a body, or what was left of one. Torn apart, limbs shredded, and blood soaking into the earth. Derek's face was ashen, his hands shaking. "We found him like this," he whispered. None of us moved, all paralyzed by what we were seeing. Om tried to call for help, but of course, there was no signal out, hands shaking. "We need to cover him up and get back to the truck," Ben said, his voice tight. "We'll get a signal there." We dragged a tarp over the remains and started the trek back, but every step felt heavier than the last. Every sound made us flinch. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on us, though I saw nothing. By the time we reached the truck, Derek managed to get a weak signal and called the authorities. They told us to stay put while they sent someone. The wait was agonizing. We huddled around a small fire, backs to each other, rifles in hand. The night was unnaturally quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, the headlights of a sheriff's truck cut through the darkness. Sheriff Joel Hawkins, an older man with a deep frown, took our statements. He pulled me aside, his voice low. "You ever seen something like this?" "No," I said, still shaken. "This isn't an animal. No bear could do that." He nodded grimly. "We'll be doing an investigation, but you boys should head back to town. Leave this to us." We packed up quickly and drove back to the gas station in silence. The weight of what we'd seen hung over us like a dark cloud. We promised to stay in touch, but I knew that none of us would be forgetting this anytime soon. For the next week, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that body, ripped apart, lifeless. The worst part was the feeling that whatever did it was still out there, watching. One night, Derek called me. "Owen," he said, his voice shaking. "They found another body. Same thing, torn to shreds." A knot formed in my stomach. "What do we do?" "We need to go back," he said. "Figure out what's going on." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at Derek's cabin near the edge of the reservation. Ben and Tom were there too, looking as worn out as I felt. We gathered our gear, loaded our rifles, and headed back to the mountains. The forest felt different this time, oppressive. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more sinister. We split up again, staying within earshot, but as the hours passed, we found nothing. Just as we were about to head back, a foul stench hit me, a smell so rancid it made me gag. It was faint, but unmistakable. Suddenly, Ben shouted. I ran toward his voice, heart pounding, and when I reached him, he was standing over another body. Fresh, blood still pooling around it. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "What's doing this?" he whispered. Before I could answer, a noise came from the trees behind us. We spun around, rifles raised, and in the dim light, we saw something moving. It was fast, unnaturally fast, darting between the trees like a shadow. We fired, but it didn't stop. We chased it, driven by fear and adrenaline, deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer. We lost sight of the creature, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then Derek screamed. We turned to see him on the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping through his fingers. Whatever that thing was, it had struck him and disappeared into the darkness. We had no choice but to haul Derek back to the truck. The drive to the hospital was a blur, Derek's condition worsening with every passing minute. At the hospital, the doctors were baffled. His wounds looked like animal bites, but they couldn't identify the species. After we gave our statements to the authorities, they promised to investigate further, but I could tell they were as terrified as we were. Weeks passed, and the forest was silent. No more bodies were found, but the fear never left. Derek recovered physically, but he was a different person after that, withdrawn, haunted. None of us ever spoke about that night again, and we drifted apart, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd seen. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. The forest no longer feels like home, it feels like a trap. I rarely go hunting anymore, and when I do, I never go alone, because I know that somewhere, in the shadows, something is watching, waiting for its next victim.